Exploring manual modes and the exposure triangle, aperture, shutter, ISO, a workshop with Eleanor Caputo. Shooting modes. DSLR cameras come with a few different types of shooting modes, from full automatic to full manual. Since this class is all about getting out of the auto settings, we're going to take a look at the manual and manual assist modes and discuss when you should use them. Manual and manual assist modes. P. Program automatic. Sets your aperture and your shutter speed automatically, but gives you control over other settings like ISO, which is your film speed, and the on-camera flash will not fire unless you allow it. TV or S mode. Shutter priority or time value. Allows you to set the shutter speed and ISO, but allows the camera to set the aperture automatically. This mode is useful if the shutter speed is the most important consideration when taking a photo. This is often the case when you want to make sure you take a photo that's fast enough to capture motion but not care about the aperture. This is useful for sports photography, dance, or anything with a lot of movement. AV or A, aperture priority or value. Allows you to set the aperture and ISO, but lets the camera set the shutter speed automatically. This is useful when the aperture is the most important consideration in your photograph. The aperture can have some of the greatest visual impact on your photographs because it is one of the largest contributing factors to the depth of field. A wide aperture, represented by a low f-stop like f1.8, will produce a photo where your subject is in sharp focus but the background is very much out of focus. This is useful for portraits or focusing on a single object in an otherwise busy frame. A narrow aperture, represented by a higher f-stop like f8, will produce a photo where most everything appears to be in focus. This is useful for landscapes or any other situation where keeping everything in focus is desirable. Wider apertures also let in more light, so they're useful when you don't have much and want to avoid using a flash. Aperture priority, AV, is one of the best shooting modes your camera has because you can still control your ISO settings, and the shutter speed is often something that's best left for the camera to decide unless you have a reason to choose it yourself. Manual mode, or M, lets you set everything: the ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and white balance. It's worth noting, however, that manual camera mode is not related to manual focus. Switching between manual and automatic focus is generally a toggle switch on your lens. Manual focus is possible in any mode as long as the toggle switch is set to manual lens. B, or bulb, is a mode that affects the shutter speed and allows long exposure times under the direct control of the photographer. With this setting, the shutter simply stays open as long as the shutter button remains depressed. A tripod is necessary for bulb mode. If you use your finger to manually depress the shutter button and hold it, as you breathe or make subtle movements, you will inadvertently move your camera ever so slightly, causing very noticeable movement, so a programmable intervalometer should be used. Exposure triangle, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. In this section, I will explain your aperture, ISO, and shutter and how they work together. Aperture Aperture is a measure of how open or closed the lens's iris is. A wider aperture, or lower f number, means more light will be let in by the lens, simply because the opening is larger. A narrower aperture, or higher f number, allows less light to reach the sensor. You might wonder why we would ever want less light to reach the sensor. The answer, the majority of the time, is that we want a larger depth of field. Depth of field is an effect of aperture. Narrower apertures, higher f numbers, give a greater depth of field, allowing more of a scene to be in focus. Think landscapes. Wider apertures, lower f numbers, create a narrow depth of field, which can help isolate a subject and is one of the greatest compositional tools at your disposal. Think portraiture. You should also note that most lenses are their sharpest around f5.6 or f8. However, many photographers are willing to trade some sharpness for the subject isolating effects of a wider aperture. Some lenses will have a range such as f3.5 to 5.6. You'll see this on zoom lenses, and it means that when the lens is zoomed out to the widest position, it's f3.5. But when it's zoomed in all the way, it can only have an aperture as wide as f5.6. The middle changes as well, so halfway through the zoom range, you'll end up with a widest aperture of about f4.5. Some more expensive lenses have fixed apertures that do not change when zoomed. Notice the diagram up here with the f-stops. I've indicated each f-stop. There's more f-stops in between, but these are some of the most popular. And you can see here's their adjoining f numbers, and you can see the effects of each aperture setting and what it does to your subject. As you can see, an f1.8, your subject is very sharp, but your background is quite blurred, and that really pops your subject out of the background very nicely. That's very, very desirable in portraiture. When you get all the way up to f22, you can see your aperture is closed down quite a bit, letting less light in, but creating a very much deeper depth of field. So you can see that your subject is actually competing with your background, because your background is now as sharp as your subject. And if it's a very busy background, your subject will get lost in it. This is great for landscapes. Anything from f8 on up is really good for landscapes. Here in this diagram, you can see that I've taken a photograph of 6 pins, and at f2.8 I'm focused on the middle red pin, and you can see that all the pins in front and all the pins behind are very, very soft. That is a wide open aperture and a very shallow depth of field. And here again at f22, the opening is much smaller, and you can see focused in on the red pin that everything in front and everything behind is much sharper, and you can see all the detail. So a wide aperture of f2.8 lets more light in, and the effect is a shallow depth of field. A narrow aperture like f22 provides deeper focus but lets in less light. What aperture you should use depends on the situation and the type of lens you're using and the outcome you would like to achieve. Shutter speed. I've included a little graph of your shutter speeds from 30 seconds all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. Shutter speed is a measure of how long the shutter remains open, and thus how long the sensor is exposed to light. Faster shutter speeds give the sensor less time to collect light and thus result in a lower exposure. Slower shutter speeds allow more time for the sensor to collect light and result in a higher exposure. A side effect of a slow shutter is a lovely silky water. A good reason you might want to use a higher shutter speed is to stop motion. whether that be camera shake or a subject that is moving, allowing us to maintain sharpness. Remember, as long as the shutter is open, the camera is essentially recording the position of elements in the frame. If one of those elements moves, the result will often be undesired blurriness. So the darker the situation, the lower and slower your shutter will need to be. For bright and active situations, you will need a fast shutter. You need to capture that action and not have it be blurry. So you would use shutter settings above 1/60th of a second up to as high as your situation will allow. Usually our goal is to try to use the fastest shutter possible and the lowest ISO possible. During bright daylight conditions, that is not hard to accomplish, but as the light fades, so does our ability to stop camera shake and motion blur from occurring in our photos. ISO. In digital photography, ISO measures the sensitivity of the image sensor. The same principles apply as in film photography. The lower the number, the less sensitive your camera is to light, and the finer the grain. Higher ISO settings are generally used in darker situations to get faster shutter speeds. So why ever use a high ISO? Often, when working in lower light, you will find yourself at a point where you are using the widest possible aperture and the slowest shutter speed you can to stop the action. At this point, your only choice is to increase the ISO. The lens cannot physically open itself any wider, and as discussed above, sacrificing sharpness for a slower shutter speed is rarely advisable. I would rather have a grainy image that shows a well-defined subject than a smoother image with a subject lost in blur. Putting it all together. Using these settings together, referred to as exposure value or EV, changes with every exposure. There are no rules. It all depends on what you are taking a picture of, what the conditions are, and what effect you want to achieve. If you are trying to isolate your subject from the background, then you want to open your lens aperture to a wide setting like f5.6 or less. This lets in a lot of light, so chances are in daylight you will be able to use a very fast shutter speed, ensuring you don't get camera shake or blurriness, and it also means that you'll be able to keep your ISO down to a nice low sensitivity like 100 ISO. Now let's say you want to capture a landscape and it's slightly cloudy or getting toward dusk. You need to ensure sharpness all the way through the scene. So what do we have to do with these three settings to get that shot? Well, first off, since we have to ensure sharpness, we will need a narrow aperture of say f11 on up, which closes the lens, letting less light through and deepening our depth of field, calling for a tripod to reduce camera shake. But doing so will mean that we have to get our light another way. How do we do that? Well, we adjust our shutter speed next. Since we don't have moving objects in our scene, we can use a pretty long shutter speed and not have to worry about camera shake or motion blur, especially since we will be using a tripod. So in this case, you may only need to adjust 2 of the 3 elements of the triangle. Now, let's say you were shooting the races or something with movement or action. You would not want your shutter speed to be longer than 1/60th of a second, because any slower or longer would make you susceptible to movement. That is when you would have to open the aperture all the way, and if that didn't even out your exposure on the exposure indicator, then you would have to raise that ISO. You'll have to compromise grain for sharpness. ISO is usually my last resort. Since sharpness is more important than grain, then I will sacrifice the grain.